Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you on such a lovely day, perhaps a little bit hotter than we'd prefer, but it's lovely to have the summer with us at last. The book of Habakkuk is a fascinating little book. It's one of the shortest books in the Old Testament, and we know very little of its writer, though he must have been well known, as he only describes himself as just the prophet Habakkuk. He was obviously known to those in Jerusalem that he was writing to. Surprisingly, he's the only one of all the written prophets in the Old Testament that calls himself a prophet. And even the meaning of his name is unclear. There's debate as to whether it's got a Hebrew or some other kind of derivation. And the only real hint we have in the book about him is the very end of the last chapter, where it says, "To the chief musician with my stringed instruments," when he's written a hymn of faith. And this suggests that maybe he was one of the Levite musicians in the temple in Jerusalem, but we really don't know. The date's not certain either, but it is written towards the end of the kingdom of Judah, as it warns of God's judgments. In verse 6, God says, "For I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth." So it's about 600 BC, and probably in the time of King Jehoiakim, just before the end of the nation of Judah. And yet, despite this lack of precise information, it's a fascinating book with quite a different emphasis to most of the other prophets. Unlike the other prophets, Habakkuk does not focus mainly on warning Judah about their sins, but rather he reflects on a religious problem. And that problem is how God deals with wickedness, first in his people Israel, and second, wickedness of the Gentile nations. And as a result, how should God's followers react? In other words, Habakkuk focuses on the sins of the oppressor rather more than he does the sins of Judah. The first chapter starts with Habakkuk's first question. Why is there wickedness rife in Judah, and why is violence so prevalent? It sounds a bit like our world and our global news now, doesn't it? The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, "O Lord, how long shall I cry and you not hear, even cry to you violence and you'll not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There's strife and contention. Therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds." It's a very sad situation for Judah. And yet we note it's not wrong, when things puzzle you, to ask God about them. We should all understand that God welcomes our prayers, including those where we ask him questions and say we're struggling to understand, especially when things are tough, as they were in the nation at Habakkuk's time. And of course, it's not wrong for us to ask when we are struggling with personal problems in our life too. And this time Habakkuk gets an immediate reply in verse 5. God says, "Look among the nations and watch and be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. For I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth, to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves." So Habakkuk gets an answer, but this is not good news. It's not the kind of thing he wanted to hear. Verses 9 and 10 add, "They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings. The princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold. They heap up earthen mounds and seize them." Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits an offence, ascribing this power to his God. This reply from God prompts Habakkuk's second question. Surely God can't let the Chaldeans an even more evil nation than Judah is at the moment, be the means of punishing Judah. They'd seen the way Chaldeans behaved when they captured Assyria and Egypt, and that was not nice. They're violent, vicious and godless. Verses 12 and 13 say, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he?" Judah may not have been perfect, but compared to the Chaldeans, they weren't doing too bad, I guess is the thing he's saying. The Chaldeans treated people just like fish caught in a net, and they had no more compunction about killing a person than they had of killing a fish. They even worshipped their nets. In verse 16, "Therefore they sacrificed to their nets," is the reply of Habakkuk. I'm not sure if this is literally what happened. They may have worshipped their nets, but I think it's more likely a poetic way of saying they trusted in their own army and their own strength, and it became to them their God. We see that often enough in present times, don't we? With the nations around us who trust in their own strength. And we see it sometimes in ourselves, don't we? We trust in our own strength and don't put things in God's hands. So Habakkuk ends with the final question: shall they empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? He's asked God about evil and how God is bringing judgment. Questions that challenge Habakkuk's idea of morals. He wants to understand God's way. Why is this kind of thing happening in my life, he's saying. The first verse of chapter 2 is an interesting response. It reads, "I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart," this is Habakkuk speaking, "and watch and see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I'm corrected." Here Habakkuk demonstrates by his actions a very valuable lesson for us. When we ask God, sometimes an answer comes quickly, like Habakkuk's first question, but often it will not come straight away. We must be prepared to wait for God's answer. We must put into our lives some quiet time and a quiet place to think on our God and what he wants from us and how we should respond to his messages. We need to set aside time to pray, to meditate, to read his word. Habakkuk picked a watchtower on the ramparts of Jerusalem to do that, away from the noise and the crowd. Christ did it frequently, didn't he? It was necessary for him, and I think we should be following this example. We have the example of Christ, of David, of Paul, and of Habakkuk, who decided they could find a closer relationship with God and a better understanding of what he wanted from them by setting aside time to think about him away from the hurly-burly of everyday lives. I'm not sure that we have to go into a wilderness or into a watchtower on Jerusalem's wall. Perhaps we just need to move a little bit further away from the hurly-burly of everyday life in our heads and stop and think a bit. God's answer comes in chapter 2 and verse 2. God says, or Habakkuk says, "The Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it surely will come, it will not tarry." Here comes an answer, says God, but it's not going to happen right away. So write it down so you and others can think about it when it comes. But nevertheless, though it will tarry for a while, it won't tarry forever. It will certainly come. And then comes the one verse real answer in verse 4. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. The first part of the verse about the proud and his soul not upright in him has a clear implication. The Chaldeans, the proud, may seem at first to succeed, but in contrast to the just, they're going to die. It's the just who live. This short phrase, the just shall live by his faith, is very well known to us. It's quoted in Romans and Galatians and Hebrews in the New Testament. But the exact meaning's not quite clear at first when we think about it. In Habakkuk, in the New King James and the King James, it's the just shall live by his faith. Which faith is this he's talking about? In the New Testament, it's just the just shall live by faith. Does it mean the just shall live by his own faith? Or does it mean the just shall live by mine, that is God's faith? Apparently the scholars tell me, though I've got no idea from the Hebrew, that it has probably almost certainly the meaning that the just will live by God's faithfulness, not by anything that the faithful person will do for himself. In other words, an ellipsis if you like, the just shall live by faith in my faithfulness is what God is saying. We might say by faith in God's promises. It is this faith in God that's the hope of those in Habakkuk's time, and it's the same for us. The real meaning's made a little bit clearer when we look at how this verse is used in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, who has faith." Faith and belief are cognate words in the New Testament. To the Jew first and also for the Greek. He goes on in verse 17 to say, "For in it," that is in the gospel of Christ, "the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." And he quotes Habakkuk to prove his point. But what does he mean by from faith to faith? It's not immediately obvious. Perhaps the context gives us a clue, and I think this is probably what it means in Romans, that salvation is bestowed through faith in Christ and the gospel that he's just been talking about, but not law or works, which was the problem for Paul in the Romans letter. In other words, the salvation is to those who show a faith in God and who show in that faith a responsive faith in the life they live by steadfastly believing in Jesus. As James would say in his letter, a faith shown by his works. The second time Habakkuk's quoted is in Galatians 3 verse 11, where Paul says to the Galatians that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. It's clear from Habakkuk and what God said to him, says Paul, that it's not the law that save you or the works. And the third time is in Hebrews chapter 10. The writer is just in Hebrews reminded them that they shouldn't lose confidence because Christ has not returned. Some of them had expected Jesus before then. And so that reminder is certainly true for us many years later, is it not? Then he quotes from verse 37 and 38 from the Septuagint, and he says, "For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry." You can hear the slightly different translation of the Septuagint of Habakkuk, can't you, there, about Christ coming eventually. And then he goes on to say, "Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." I guess the first point of the writer's quote in Hebrews is that Christ is going to come, even though he tarries, and we should never doubt that. And the second is that faith in God is the essence of our hope, the gospel, and of our salvation. And thirdly, interestingly, he reverses the two phrases in Habakkuk and puts the positive one first, the just shall live by faith. And then talks about the Chaldeans and anyone else who rejects Christ, and saying, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Of the book of Habakkuk, a very famous Jewish rabbi hundreds of years ago wrote, Moses gave us 613 laws, David gave us 10, Isaiah gave us 2, but Habakkuk gives us 1. It's a kind of a cute little phrase, but I think it totally misses the point. It falls into a legalistic trap. It's not laws that save us, whether it's 613 or 10 or 2 or even 1. Paul clearly shows, and Habakkuk emphasised, that our salvation's due to God's grace. We don't have to clock up a number of right deeds or laws. We just have to have faith in God's love and his promises and his grace towards us. The rest of chapter 2 is a poem where an imaginary people take up a taunting proverb against the Chaldeans, telling of their woes or their wrongdoings and the fact that God will judge them. In verse 6, will not all these take up a proverb against him and a taunting riddle against him and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? The first woe is all about greed. And down in verse 8, because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. In other words, God will judge you in spite of what you are doing. Woe number 2 in verse 9 is about covetousness. Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high. And down in verse 11, the result, for the stone will cry out from the wall and the beam from the timbers will answer. Even the very houses will tell them that they've done the wrong thing. Woe 3 is about violence in verse 12. Woe those who build a town with bloodshed, who establish a city by iniquity. And then there's a beautiful contrast. Verse 13, behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the people labour to feed the fire and nations weary themselves in vain. And the contrast is, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And another one of these wonderful key verses in Habakkuk. It's interesting. He's drawing a quite interesting contrast here. He takes the message of Numbers 14, verse 21, when, interestingly, God had just shown compassion and forgiven the nation for their sins, where God says, as truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. But Habakkuk adds what Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 11, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And he puts them together to make a beautiful summary of God's purpose, using both the Genesis and Isaiah ideas. The earth shall be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe 4 in chapter 15 is despising others. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbour, pressing him to the bottle to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. And in end of verse 16, the cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory. And woe 5, the last one, is idolatry in verse 19. Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, yet there is no breath at all. And then that wonderful contrast that we had in our meditation hymn this morning. In contrast to all of the chaos of the Chaldeans, all the judgments for their horribleness to Judah and to the nations around them, Habakkuk says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. Idols are an emptiness. They're of no point. Just as the idols in our life are an emptiness. And if we only sit and meditate on God, then we'll be in so much better position than any of the idols we worship in our present life. You know, sometimes I think we miss the point of God's prophets. We seem to be looking for ways to use them to tell when Jesus will return, which is not what God intends. Even Jesus didn't know when he was going to come back. It's not to help predict the future. God's got that future under control and we can relax and it will come, even though it tarries. Rather, the point of the prophets is to help the reader live a godly life in the reader's present time. For the people of Habakkuk's time, the message was to help them see far past their present troubles, which are going to get worse in the next 40 or 50 years when the Chaldeans came down and surrounded and took Jerusalem. And in those troubles, to have a confident faith in God's ultimate justice and mercy, to have a confident faith in God's promises. Now, the message of Habakkuk was for those people in Jerusalem in his time. But it would have been just as good for those people in Jerusalem in AD 70 when the Romans surrounded the nation and the capital. It was just as relevant, it would have been just as helpful. Throughout history, Habakkuk and any prophet would be helpful to anyone. Anyone in the Spanish Inquisition, anyone under Nazi German persecution could read Habakkuk and see a real hope beyond their present trials. I guess the same message is true today. If you were a Jew or a Christian in Afghanistan, Habakkuk would be a good chapter to read today, wouldn't it? God is in ultimate control, and through all present troubles, he has a greater plan for all the faithful, all the time. And there's also, of course, the same message for us individually, as well as the national message. In those times when we feel down for any reason, and they come along, Habakkuk says, always remember, the just shall live by faith. We don't have time to look at chapter 3 in detail. Jordan's going to read us a part of that later after the emblems. Hebrew scholars tell us it's a very special kind of complex poetry with a whole lot of whole lot of Hebrew phrases made up of just 3 words, all put together in a way that's unlike any poetry in the rest of the Old Testament. For us now, the point of chapter 3, I think, is that Habakkuk imagines Messiah coming, and he writes a sort of a poetic prayer about that. And he does it by thinking about the time when he remembers the story of the greatest of God's interventions in the life of the nation. And that was the vision of God in action in the Exodus. So he talks about plagues, and there may be plagues when Jesus comes back. I don't think it's an allusion to the plague we're in the middle of now. I think it's much more likely an allusion in Habakkuk 3 to the plagues in Egypt. He talks about thundering mountains like Sinai, though Sinai's not mentioned. He talks about rivers coming from mountain cliffs. He talks about waters divided. He talks about the sun standing still. It's all portrayed in poetry, and it's a way of him showing confidence in the fact that he thinks Messiah will definitely come to establish his kingdom, and that will be a vision to him of God in glorious action, bringing ultimate salvation. However, there is associated with it a time of trouble and judgment upon those that oppose Christ, and he hints at that too. And I think that is what's at the heart of that last few verses in chapter 3, which I just like to read. It's a beautiful hymn of faith. After talking about Christ's coming in poetic language, he says, "Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vine, though the labour of the olive may fall and the fields yield no food, though the flocks may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls." In other words, though tough times might come now or when Christ returns even, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like a deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. Habakkuk's prophecy starts with questions to God. Why? And ends with an unshakable faith, the sure knowledge that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, and that the just shall live by faith. Habakkuk teaches us to ask God questions and to be patient as we wait for God's answers, to be confident that the vision will surely come. To us, his message is clear and pointed. The God that brought Israel out of Egypt, the God that sent his prophets like Habakkuk with messages for us, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, is our God, and we can confidently, patiently wait for him. His ultimate vision will surely come, and we can take wonderful comfort that in the end the just shall live by faith.